first element that we'll cover is perspective. Perspective is basically the point of view that the viewer is seeing when the picture is taken. Now, why is this important? Why focus so much on our perspective? When you're at a national monument or a really famous landmark, most people are going to take the same exact photo, standing in the most popular spot right in front of whatever it is and snapping that photo. To make our pictures more interesting, we want to think outside the box. Most people are seeing things from head level. Now, I know everyone's not the same height, but around that area, everyone's viewing the world from that perspective. So it's our job to find a more interesting point of view or perspective, thinking outside of the box, seeing things from different angles that people usually don't see things at that angle or perspective. So perspective, we want to think outside the box and come up with new ways to view things. Next is depth, which is essentially creating more layers to our photo, creating depth and dimension in it. Now, when creating depth, your perspective will also come into play. Choosing your perspective can either add depth or take away depth. And you'll see later on in these few lessons that one element can affect a different one in one way or another. But let's go ahead and take a look at this photo here, which has good depth. As you can see, there are quite a few layers. We have the foreground here, which is a little blurry. We then have the next layer, which is this water. Then we have this nice row of trees and the background with the mountains and sky. As you can see, there are quite a few layers here, making this photo much more interesting to look at. Here's another photo. This one's still a good photo, but it's just not quite as interesting. There's not as many layers. We do have maybe one layer here, but it's not as engaging as the other one. Here's a great example of when changing my perspective actually added more depth to my photo. By getting lower to the ground, I was able to create an extra layer in the foreground to add a few more layers to this photo. Now, you couldn't really say one of these pictures are better than the other, but when thinking about your perspective, creating depth is one of your main goals when choosing it. So we've came up with an interesting perspective, we've created some depth, but there's still something that our photo is lacking, which is a subject. Now, lots of times I will have students send me photos which are by all means a great photo, but they're just lacking in some areas and it's mostly a subject. There's nothing for the viewer to rest their eyes on and look at, which is blatantly the subject in the photo. Here's an example of a photo that is just lacking in subject. There's not a whole lot going on in this photo and the eyes need more to look at. But by placing a subject in this environment makes this photo 10 times better. But sometimes you can have too much subject. Now, what does that mean? What I mean by that is you have too many elements in your photo competing to be the subject. But that doesn't mean you can't have more than one subject. I know it can get a little confusing, but there's a fine line between multiple subjects and too many subjects competing to be the center of attention. In this photo, we have two subjects, me and the fox. But the fox is the more dominant subject because its face is really sharp and in focus, and I'm a little bit more blurred out, making it so the viewer's eyes go straight towards the fox first. So even though there are two subjects in this photo, one of them is clearly the more dominant subject. In my opinion, the subject is probably one of the most important elements of photography and composition. If you don't have a subject in your photo, then you don't really have anything much in your photo at all. Leading lines are a fantastic tool and way to help your viewer find your subject. Leading lines are lines or shapes in the photo that help direct the viewer's eyes to the subject. The more you take pictures and practice, the easier it'll become to find natural leading lines in your environment. But regardless of the name leading lines, the lines you're looking for don't have to be perfectly straight lines. Anything that you can find that helps direct the eyes towards the subject. Any type of shape, any sort of jagged line, anything at all will work. And the more you take photos and look around in the world, the more you will find leading lines everywhere, and you'll be able to use them to your advantage to isolate your subject even more. Moving on, we have balance in dead space. Balance and dead space, I think, are another one that's really important when it comes to taking photos. If you don't have any balance, the photo isn't very nice to look at, and a lot of dead space can just make the picture look lost and have no direction. Let me show you what I mean. So when it comes to balance, this frame right now looks pretty balanced. But if I were to move over here next to the bookshelf, now you can see there's a big empty white wall right there, and the frame just looks out of place and doesn't look very balanced anymore. But if I were to move back, now the frame looks a lot more balanced. This applies with the photos you take as well. You want to make sure there's a consistent balance in your photo. Now you can use different elements like lighting, color, contrast, different things like that to balance your photo out. We really want to avoid having a lot of dead space. So if you have a big blue sky up top or a lot of ground in the foreground, we want to crop that out so your picture looks more full and we're getting rid of as much dead space as possible. But here's an example of when I was faced with a very clear and boring sky, but I was able to use parts of the teepee to balance out my photo. With the sticks from the teepee protruding into the sky, it therefore makes this picture very well balanced, even though there are no clouds in the sky. Here we have this dirt road stretching out into this beautiful landscape. On the left we have some barns and a little house out on the prairie and some mountains off in the background. Now you might think the balance is off because all of the subjects and objects are to the left of the picture, but over to the right we have a lot of deep dark clouds in the sky and a lot of light over by the subjects, therefore balancing out this entire photo. So balance is one of the key things when it comes to making a aesthetically pleasing photo. Alright, now light plays a very big role in all of your photos and how they're going to look and turn out. Like I said before, I don't recommend using the flash on your iPhone because it's really weak and sometimes it can cause discoloration in your photos. I personally recommend using natural light that you can find out in the world. Now, depending on what time of day you take your photo, the lighting is obviously going to be different. Now, in the morning, in the evening, we're going to have golden hour, which is going to make your photos look really warm, and the lighting's going to look really nice because it's going to be coming in from the side across the horizon. In the middle of the day, the sun is going to be directly above you, which can create really harsh shadows on people's faces and other subjects. Or if it's the middle of the day and a nice cloudy overcast day, that is going to create some really nice optimal lighting. Basically what the clouds do is create a nice filter over the sun, creating some nice soft ambient lighting, which therefore makes the shadows really subtle and soft as well. But also don't be afraid to create your own light or find man-made light like in cities and around buildings and other things like that. Bringing a light with you, even just a flashlight, can help you create some really interesting photos. And finally, our ultimate goal when it comes to taking photos is to tell a story. This isn't so much as an element of composition, but we can use all these different elements of composition that we just talked about to portray a story in our photo, making the viewer much more engaged in what's going on in our photo. Here's a really good example of storytelling in a photo. These are some birds I was taking a picture of out over the lake, and as you can see, the pelican was going after the other, trying to steal a fish from it. But not all photos have to have a super complicated or really in-depth story. For example, this photo right here, all the story is that there's a road that goes out into a field and there's a house on the side and there's a storm coming over. That's all the story is. Or here's another one. All the story is that there's a frog on a stick or a leaf. The story doesn't have to be crazy. It just has to be intriguing enough to become a photo. But if you're taking great photos and applying composition and having a subject, story is just going to come along with it. It's not going to be something that you have to force into it. Now that we've gone over all these elements of composition and gone over these rules that you can follow to create great and interesting composition, what I want you to do now is learn to break these rules. Because at the end of the day, rules are meant to be broken. I know it sounds cheesy, but there's no one saying a photo can't be good because you didn't follow this rule of perspective. At the end of the day, they're your photos, and if they look good, then they're a good photo. As long as people like looking at them or you like looking at them, they're a good photo. Great photographers break these rules all the time. I've seen tons of photos where there's no depth and it's an amazing photo. I've seen tons of photos where the subject is all over the place or the lighting is crazy. You're the photographer, you're the creator, you have the vision in your mind and the power to capture whatever you want. Here's a photo that pretty much has no depth at all or super isolated subject, but it's still a great photo. This one has a ton of dead space, but it is still a balanced photo. Here's another one that has a ton of dead space, and you could say that it's not balanced because all of the subject is at the bottom of the photo, but it's still a great photo. When you break these rules of composition, sometimes you turn out with the best and most unexpected photos. So break these rules. It's really important to know these rules so you can break them.